The day you become the first millionaire in your family isn't the day your life changes. It's the day everyone else's does. The wire cleared on a Tuesday. $1.6 million for something you've been building quietly for 9 years. Something nobody in your family ever fully understood. You didn't celebrate. You sat in your driveway with the engine off and watched your father, Grant, 64 years old, lying on a flattened cardboard box under your car, draining the oil himself because he said the shop would charge you $40 to do a $10 job. He had no idea about any of it. Your phone buzzed against the cup holder. One text. Your brother heard you sold. We should talk. You read it twice because here's the thing, you hadn't told him. You hadn't told anyone. You decide, sitting right there in the driveway, that you're going to keep it quiet for a while. You haven't said the number out loud yet. You haven't told your mother. You've told no one. So how does Dean already know? You didn't post anything. The deal was private. The only people who knew were lawyers and a bank, and none of them know Dean exists. You start typing, who told you? Then you delete it because you already understand something you won't be able to unlearn for the rest of your life. Money is the one secret that tells itself. You put the phone face down under the car. Your father grunts, tightens the drain plug, and asks if you've got a funnel in the garage. Not did the deal close, not are we rich now, just funnel. You go get it, and for about 4 minutes, standing in your garage holding a plastic funnel, everything is still normal. Your phone buzzes again. You don't look. It buzzes a third time. You do. 3 texts now, all from Dean. The last one just 2 words. And those 2 words are the first crack in a thing you didn't know could break. Don't forget. Don't forget what? You don't know yet. But you will. What you're remembering instead is a night 12 years ago. You were broke enough to hear the fridge humming because there was almost nothing inside it. And Dean, who had almost nothing himself, drove 40 minutes in the cold and pressed his last $40 into your hand and refused to take it back. Pay me when you're a millionaire, he'd laughed. You look at the text again. Don't forget. Word travels the way it always does, through your mother, Carol, who can't hold a secret the way a screen door can't hold a draft. By the weekend everyone knows. And so the family does what families do when something big happens. They throw a cookout. It's loud and it's warm and it's exactly the kind of afternoon you'd have loved a year ago. Folding tables, your uncle burning the burgers on purpose because that's his whole personality, kids running through a sprinkler. And you, moving through it, watching everyone watch you a little differently than they used to. Dean gets to you with a beer in his hand and a grin, and he says it loud so the table can hear. Careful around this guy, he'll charge you for the ride home now. The table laughs. You laugh too. And that's the trap because it feels like love. It isn't. It's got the shape of love. The teasing, the whole family laughing at the kid who made good. And for 1 second you let yourself believe nothing's changed. Your Aunt Paulette asks if you've eaten. Someone pours a drink. It's easy. It's family. You feel your shoulders come down for the first time all week. Then the cousin you barely talk to slides in next to you and half joking, all the way serious, says, so when you start hiring you'll think of family first, right? He laughs and you laugh and someone else laughs. A joke is just how people ask for something they're not brave enough to say out loud. You're starting to hear it now, under every laugh, a small open hand waiting. You look back across the yard for Dean's grin, but he's not grinning anymore. He's watching you laugh the joke off and something crosses his face, fast, gone in an instant. Disappointment. He didn't want it to be a joke. You wanted it to land. And you realize, with your paper plate going soft in your hand, that the hardest conversation of your life hasn't happened yet. And it's going to start with the one person who once gave you everything he had. You don't go looking for it. That's what makes it worse. You're at the dealership for something boring, a recall notice, 40 minutes you'll never get back. You're at the service desk when you see him through the glass. Dean, out on the lot, walking a salesman down a row of trucks. The way a man walks when he wants to be seen walking. He hasn't noticed you yet. So you watch and you do the math you wish you didn't know how to do. You know his paycheck. You know his rent. You know, to the dollar, what he can carry. And the truck he's circling isn't one he can carry. It's one that'll carry him for about 4 months before it starts carrying him under. Then he sees you and he doesn't look caught. He looks delighted. Waves you over loud enough for the salesman. Perfect timing. Tell me this isn't clean, slapping the hood like he already owns it. And you understand, this was never about the truck. A week ago he saw your car. This is his answer. For 20 minutes, you watch Dean sell himself a vehicle he doesn't want, to impress a brother who never asked him to. He says the price without being asked, then checks your face to see if it's enough. He's not buying a truck. He's buying back the few inches he thinks he lost the day your wire cleared. And here's the part you can't say out loud. You would trade every dollar to get back the brother who drove 40 minutes in the cold to hand you his last $40. That one gave when he had nothing. This one is spending money he doesn't have, so the gap between you won't show. People don't resent your success. They resent what it says about their own choices. By the time you get home, it isn't just him. There's Paulette on your phone now. A quick opportunity just needs a little to get moving. You'd practically be doing her a favor. And Carol started a sentence she never used to say. Well, now that you can afford it, not a question. A reclassification. You used to be her son. Now you're a resource that happens to have her son's face. And you haven't spent a single dollar yet. Then Dean calls, not a text, a call. He wants you to come by. Wants to run something by you. And there's a softness in his voice you haven't heard in months. The old softness. And against everything you just watched on that lot, it works. You want it to be the old him so badly that you say yes before you've hung up. You shouldn't have. You sit at his kitchen table, the same table you've sat at 100 times. There's coffee. He's nervous in a way that almost makes you trust it because the man at the dealership wasn't nervous about anything. Then he says the number, $40,000. And under the table, 12 years quietly rearrange themselves. $40 then. $40,000 now. Pay me when you're a millionaire. He's not asking for a loan. In his mind, he's collecting one. It can't lose, he says, those exact words, and lays out a plan that's 80% confidence and 20% detail. This is the moment you're supposed to say no. And for a second you almost do. You think about the lot, the slapped hood, the price he said out loud just to watch your face. A quiet voice in you says, he doesn't want help. He wants to be even. And you can't buy a man even. You know that voice is right. You say yes anyway. You don't say yes to the deal. You say yes to the face across the table, to the small chance the money buys back the brother who drove through the cold. It's only money, you tell yourself. You, of all people, can afford to be wrong about $40,000. The relief on his face almost makes it worth it. Almost. And for a while it works. This is the part nobody warns you about because it's the part that does the real damage. 2 weeks in, Dean shows up at your house on a Sunday morning. No ask. He's got 2 coffees and a ladder strapped to that ridiculous truck, and he says he noticed your gutters were sagging last time he drove by, and he just climbs up and does them. 3 hours. Won't take anything for it. Halfway up the ladder, he looks down at you and grins, that real grin, the 12 years ago grin, and says, I'm paying back every dollar. You know that, right? And you believe him. Standing in your own yard holding a coffee he bought, you believe him completely. You think, I was wrong about all of it. The dealership, the ant, the open hands. Money didn't break us. It got tested and it held. You let your guard all the way down. That's when it goes. The call comes the next Sunday. The deal that couldn't lose lost all of it. There's no apology, no thank you for the $40,000 that just evaporated. There's something you don't recognize at first because you've never heard it from him. He's asking for more. Not asking exactly. He's explaining why you're going to give it. The first 40 was just to get in, he says. Pulling out now wastes it. You can't stop halfway. You wouldn't even feel another 30. He says it like your money is a limb that's gone numb. You sit with the phone against your ear and you don't say anything. You're not thinking about the $30,000. You're thinking about the ladder and the gutters and the grin, and how he must have already known about this deal that Sunday morning. The coffee, the gutters, all of it. The favor wasn't kindness. It was a deposit. Generosity, the moment you give it, stops being a gift and becomes the baseline. So you tell him no. Your first no. Comes out softer than you mean it to, almost an apology. He goes quiet. Says okay. Says I get it. Hangs up. 2 days of nothing. You start to think the no held. Then Carol calls and she opens with a sentence that tells you exactly who got to her first. Why are you doing this to your brother? You don't even know how to answer it because the question has already decided you're guilty. You start to explain, the $40,000, the deal that lost, the second ask, and you hear your mother go quiet on the other end. Not listening quiet. Waiting quiet. Waiting for you to finish so she can say the thing she called to say. He's struggling, she says. And you have so much now. There it is. So much now. As if the number changed what you owe her. As if love came with a sliding scale and yours just went up. You want to tell her he didn't lose the money, he set fire to it and called you for more gasoline. But you don't because she's your mother and because some part of you knows she isn't being cruel. She's just standing where she's always stood between her 2 sons. Except now one of them has everything and one of them has a story. And she's already decided which one needs her. I'll think about it, you say. You won't. But you say it. And after you hang up, you realize Dean didn't argue with your no. He didn't need to. He just walked down the hall to a room you can't enter and let your mother carry the message back. He's not fighting you anymore. He's recruiting. A boundary feels like betrayal to anyone who was counting on a yes. It spreads quietly after that. It's never a confrontation, that's what no one tells you. It's a text left on read for the first time in your life. It's Paulette, who used to call you champ, now calling you moneybags with a laugh that has a little hook in it. None of it is big enough to point at. If you brought any single piece of it up, you'd sound paranoid, rich and paranoid. So you say nothing. You just feel the temperature of every room drop half a degree when you walk in. And in the middle of all of it, your father, who has still not said one word about the money, shows up unannounced that same week, the way he does with no reason at all. He doesn't need anything fixed and he doesn't bring it up. He just sits at your kitchen table for an hour drinking coffee, telling you a long pointless story about a guy he used to work with, laughing at his own ending. Then he rinses his cup, puts it in the rack and goes home. No opportunity. No, now that you can afford it. He drove over to do nothing but sit with you. You don't think much of it yet. You will. Because right now all you can feel is the strange new loneliness of being the most resented person in a family that used to be yours. And Thanksgiving is in 10 days. You almost don't go. You sit in the driveway for a minute first, the same driveway where this all started, and you think about turning the car around. But you go in because not going would be its own kind of confession, and because some part of you still believes that a table with food on it can hold a family together by force. For an hour it almost does. It's careful. Everyone's careful. The conversation stays on the safe things, the food, the game, somebody's kid's braces. Dean is across the table, not next to you, which somebody arranged without saying so. He's quiet, quieter than you've ever seen him at a table. He's a few drinks in, and you can see him deciding something, and you keep talking to Paulette about nothing so you don't have to watch him decide it. Carol keeps the plates moving. Pass this. Did you try that? She's working too hard at it and everyone can tell. And the working too hard is its own kind of noise. And then it's nothing, a small thing. Your father asks you plainly across the table how the new place is coming along. The only person all night who's asked you a normal question like you're a normal person. And before you can answer, Dean sets down his fork. Must be nice, he says. Not loud, that's the thing. He says it almost gently. The table doesn't go silent right away. That's not how it happens. A couple people keep talking for a second, then trail off when they feel it. Your mother says his name once, soft, a warning that's also a plea. He's not looking at the food anymore. He's looking at you. And there's no grin, no joke, none of the old armor, just something tired and certain underneath it. We lost you the day that money came in, he says. You didn't get rich. You just stopped being one of us. And the worst part, the part that makes it land instead of bounce, is that he isn't shouting. He believes it. He says it the way you say something you've been carrying for months, quietly, almost sadly, like he's grieving you at your own dinner table. Nobody defends you. That's the second wound arriving right behind the first. Not because they agree with him, but because the silence is easier than picking a side out loud. And silence, you're learning, is its own answer. You look at your mother. She's looking at her plate. You look for your father, and your father is the only one looking back at you. And for 1 second, before you can stop it, a thought you're ashamed of goes through you. Maybe he's right. Maybe you did change. Maybe the money did something to you that you can't see from the inside. It's gone as fast as it came, but it leaves a mark. Because the cruelest part of an unfair accusation is the half second you spend wondering if it's true. You set down your napkin. You say something quiet about needing to head out and nobody fights you on it. And that's the loneliest part of the whole night, how easy you are to let leave. People will forgive you for having money. They'll never forgive you for having a limit. You're in the driveway almost to your car when you hear a door open behind you. Footsteps on the gravel. Not fast. Not Dean's. You don't turn around yet, but you already know whose they are. The footsteps on the gravel are your father's. He doesn't say anything about what just happened in there. He just stands with you in the cold for a second, looks at your car and says, "Drive safe. Call your mother in a few days." Then he pats the roof twice, the way he's done since you were 15, and goes back inside to a table that just broke. That's the last normal conversation you have with him. The call comes 3 weeks later, on a Wednesday, which is how you'll always remember it, that it wasn't even a weekend, that the day had no reason to be the day. Your mother's voice. You can't understand the words at first, only the shape of them. Hospital. No. Come now. You don't remember the drive. You remember the hallway, the specific quiet of a hospital at night, the way the floor shines, how your shoes are too loud. You remember Dean already there, standing against the wall, and how, for the first time in a year, there is nothing between you. No money, no truck, no scorekeeping. Just two sons in a hallway. He looks at you and his face does something it hasn't done in months. It just crumples. And you put a hand on his shoulder and he lets you. Neither of you says a word about any of it. It's gone. In an instant, the whole war is gone because it was never big enough to survive a hallway like this one. Your father is awake. Smaller than you've ever seen him, but awake. The scare has passed. The worst of it. The doctors are using careful words. He's tired. He wants the room cleared for a few minutes. He wants you. You sit in the chair beside the bed. You don't know what to say, so you say the dumb, true thing, that he scared you. He smiles a little at that. And then, in the plain voice of a man too tired to dress anything up, he tells you the thing he's never told anyone. The 60 acres upstate, your grandfather's land, the only thing your father ever owned that meant anything, the place he'd told you 100 times he wanted to be buried on, he sold it the spring before you started. You never knew. You always thought the money that got you off the ground was his savings, a little cushion he'd kept. It was the land. It was always the land. He sold his father's ground out from under his own feet, quietly, and folded the money into the start of you and never said a word. Not when the business nearly died. Not when it turned. Not the Tuesday the wire cleared and you became the first millionaire in the family, standing on soil he'd given up so you could stand anywhere at all. You sit there, and the entire last year turns over in your hands and becomes a different thing. You built it. Every brutal hour of those 9 years was yours. And no one can take that. But you never built it alone. The one person who never asked you for a dollar is the one who quietly made the first dollar possible, and then erased his own fingerprints so completely that you spent a year believing you did it by yourself. While Dean, who gave you $40 once, never let you forget it for a day. You ask him the only thing you can get out. Why? Why keep it a secret? Why let me think it was mine? And he tells you about his own brother, your Uncle Gene, a name from when you were small, a man who stopped coming around before you were old enough to ask why. Money, your father says. He lent Gene money once a long time ago. And after that, the money was always in the room with them, at every holiday, every phone call, sitting at the table like a third person, until one day Gene just stopped coming. Because it's easier to lose a brother than to sit across from a debt. I wasn't going to do that to you, he says. I wasn't going to put a number between us, so I made sure there wasn't one to find. The ones who never ask are the only ones who were never keeping score. He's tired now. He closes his eyes. He tells you to send Dean back in. You're both still mine, he says. And that's the whole sermon, the only thing he ever says about the war that nearly ended his family. He doesn't take a side. He refuses to let there be one. He comes home. He's okay, slower but okay. And nothing gets fixed. Exactly. Dean doesn't pay back the $40,000. Carol doesn't apologize for the phone call. The family doesn't reset to who it was before the wire cleared. Because families don't reset. They just learn the new shape of themselves and go on. But something in you has gone quiet. The resentment you've been carrying, the scorecard you didn't know you were keeping, it's just gone. Not because anyone earned it back. Because you finally know which kind of person each of them is. And you've stopped expecting any of them to be a different kind. The money didn't change your family. It just turned the lights on and showed you who'd been loving you in the dark the whole time. It's a Saturday a few months later. Your father's car is making a sound he doesn't like and he's about to drive it to the shop and you tell him, no, you've got it. So you lie down on a flattened cardboard box on your own driveway, and you slide under your father's car and you change his oil. It's a $10 job. The shop would charge $40. That was never the reason and you know that now. You're under there longer than the job takes, on your back in the quiet, your hands doing the thing his hands did. And you finally understand what he was saying all those years, with a wrench and a toolbox and a gate that didn't drag anymore. He was never fixing the car. He was saying I love you in the only language he had, the one that doesn't ask for anything back, the one that doesn't keep score, the one you couldn't hear until the year everyone else got loud. You tighten the drain plug. You slide out into the light. Your father standing on the porch watching you, not saying anything. You don't say anything either.